Dark rain lashes the cracked window of a tiny apartment. A weak cough echoes from a back room where Elena lies frail on her bed. Isabella, clutching a half-paid medical bill, whispers to herself, "If I can just make it through one more month." Suddenly, heavy boots climb the stairs. A sharp knock, slow, deliberate, makes the door tremble. Isabella freezes. When she opens it, a tall figure in a rain-drenched black coat fills the doorway. The glint of a gun holster under his jacket catches the light. His voice is low, controlled, and dangerous. "Your mother's debt is long overdue, and I've come to collect." As Elena struggles to sit up, Isabella steps in front of her, trembling but defiant. The man's blue eyes fix on Isabella, not with pity, but with a chilling finality, before he says the words that shatter her world. "I don't want the money anymore. You, mine, will repay her debt by becoming my wife." Thunder cracks outside. Elena breaks into sobs. Isabella stands frozen between fury and fear, her breath caught in her throat. That night, the rain came down in sheets, the kind of relentless storm that seeps into your bones and makes the city feel like it's holding its breath, and I sat by the rickety window of our tiny apartment, sketching columns for my architecture assignment while listening to my mother's soft coughs in the bedroom, telling myself we would survive another month if I could just finish the project, get to class, work my double shifts, and keep the landlord from knocking again. But deep down, I sensed that the fragile balance of our lives was about to snap. The hour was late, the rain tapped the glass like impatient fingers, and when I finally rose to check on my mother, I saw her sleeping restlessly beneath the thin quilt, her face pale, her breathing shallow, and I couldn't help whispering a silent prayer for strength, for her, for us. I had just lowered myself into the creaky chair again when a heavy knock echoed through the hallway, slow and deliberate, not like a neighbor, but like someone who already knew he owned the place. And the air in the apartment changed, as if even the shadows had drawn back to make way for whoever waited on the other side. My heart stuttered. My hand hovered over the latch, and when I opened the door, the world seemed to tilt because standing there, framed by the storm, was Dominic Moretti himself, the man whose name mothers whispered to frighten their sons away from crime, the man who ruled half the city's night without ever raising his voice, wearing a rain-darkened black coat that clung to his broad shoulders, droplets sliding from his hair onto the collar, his eyes a cold, unnerving blue that pinned me where I stood, and behind him loomed another figure, taller, broader, older, Marco Bellini, his silent shadow with a scar slicing across his brow, one hand resting near the concealed weapon at his side, as if the habit of readiness could never be unlearned. For a heartbeat, I forgot how to breathe, and then instinct made me pull the door wider because something in Dominic's expression warned me it would be worse to keep him waiting. He stepped inside without asking, as though the cramped, dimly lit apartment already belonged to him, his presence filling the space so completely that the sagging furniture and peeling walls seemed to shrink back in embarrassment, and the faint scent of rain and expensive cologne followed him in like another shadow. My mother stirred at the sound of the door and coughed again, the fragile sound that had haunted me for months. She emerged slowly from her bedroom, wearing her old housecoat, her silver-streaked hair tied in a loose bun, and the moment her eyes landed on Dominic, she froze, her fingers clutching the doorway as if to hold herself upright, and I saw a flicker of recognition, of dread, flash across her tired face. "Mr. Moretti, I—" she began, but her voice faltered under the weight of his gaze, and she pressed a hand to her chest as though she could steady her own racing heart. I hurried to her side, slipping an arm around her shoulders, trying to offer comfort even as my own pulse thundered in my ears. Dominic's voice, when it came, was low, measured, smooth as polished steel, yet carrying the edge of something far sharper. "3 years," he said, his eyes never leaving my mother's face. "3 years since I advanced you 12 months' wages to save your daughter's life. 3 years. And not a single payment. Not a word." The shame on my mother's face was like a physical blow to me. She tried to speak, to explain about her illness, about how she had meant to return to work, but the treatments, the endless hospital visits, the weakness in her lungs had stolen even the strength to climb the mansion's stairs, but her words tangled together as tears welled in her eyes, and I felt a fierce protective anger rise in me. I stepped in front of her, my body a barrier, my chin lifted even though I was painfully aware of the difference in stature between myself and the man who now stood so close I could see the reins still clinging to his lashes. She was sick, I said, my voice trembling at first, but finding steadiness as I went on. She couldn't come back, she barely survived. I owe my life to what you did, but you have no right to stand here like an executioner. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw a shadow of something, surprise, maybe even respect, cross Dominic's features, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by that unreadable calm that made him more dangerous than any man who shouted. He studied me in silence, his gaze tracing my face as though weighing my words, or perhaps measuring something else entirely, and the quiet stretched until I felt my courage waver under it. Then at last he spoke, and each syllable fell like a verdict. I don't want the money anymore. The room went still, the rain's drumming suddenly seemed distant, even my mother's breathing caught as we both tried to make sense of what he had just said. Dominic's eyes shifted from my mother to me, holding me fast, and he added in that same unhurried voice that somehow carried the weight of a decree. You'll repay your mother's debt, as my wife. For an instant, I couldn't understand the words, couldn't believe I had heard them right. Then the meaning crashed over me like the storm outside, leaving me rooted to the floor, my mouth dry, my mind scrambling to grasp how a single sentence could redraw the entire map of my future. Behind me, I felt my mother sag as though the strength had gone out of her bones, her hand slipping from my arm, and as I turned to catch her, she crumpled to her knees, tears streaking her lined cheeks, whispering my name as if it were both apology and plea, while I stood frozen between her collapsing form and the man who had just claimed my life with nothing more than a few quiet words. The room stayed frozen after Dominic's shocking declaration, the echo of his words still ringing in the damp air as if the rain itself had carried them inside. Elena, pale and trembling, clutched her shawl like it could shield her from the storm gathering in their home, while Isabella stood stiff as a blade, her heart pounding so loud she thought Dominic might hear it. He moved no closer, but his presence filled the small apartment like a shadow of inevitability, his dark eyes fixed on her with a quiet command that made her spine tighten, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was low, deliberate, leaving no space for hope. I'll give you 24 hours to decide. After that, there won't be another chance. And then he turned, the heavy boots thudding on their cracked wooden floor as he left, the door clicking shut behind him like the final stroke of a gavel in some unseen courtroom. For a long time, the only sound was Elena's muffled sobs, her frail shoulders shaking, and Isabella could not move, could not even reach for her mother because her own mind was a storm of fear, anger, and a strange, reluctant understanding that the man had not come to threaten without reason. That night stretched into a blur of silent tears and restless pacing as Isabella sat by the dim window watching the rain drip from the gutter, her fingers clutching the worn blanket she had pulled over her lap like armor, and her thoughts dragged her back to the darkest winter of her life, the one when she had been paralyzed after that terrible accident, when every day had been a war of needles, therapy, and pain, and when her mother had swallowed her pride and gone to Dominic's mansion to beg for help, coming home with 12 months' worth of advance salary clenched in her shaking hands, that money which had bought the treatments, the medicines, the chance for Isabella to stand again, remembering that bitter gratitude made Isabella's throat tight, and until she couldn't breathe, because now that same man was demanding repayment in the form of her future. In the flickering light of their old lamp, she saw her mother's face, lined with worry and guilt, and heard her whisper over and over that she never should have gone to him, never should have taken the money, that love for her daughter had led her into a bargain she could never repay. Isabella tried to reassure her, but her words fell flat, the weight of choice pressing on her chest like a stone, and sometime after midnight she crept out into the hallway, her bare feet cold against the floor, only to find Marco leaning against the railing outside their apartment, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. He didn't look surprised to see her. Perhaps Dominic had sent him to keep watch, or perhaps he simply couldn't sleep either. And when she opened her mouth to accuse him of being a henchman to a cruel man, he shook his head slowly, his sharp features softened by the moonlight, and said in a voice roughened by loyalty, yet not unkind, "He's not a monster, but don't test his patience. He's the kind of man who gives one warning and means it." Those words, meant to steady her, instead tangled deeper into her heart, because they made Dominic seem not just dangerous, but inexorably human, a man whose rules were set in stone and whose mercy came with a cost. Isabella thanked him faintly and went back inside, curling up beside her mother on the thin mattress, watching the fragile rise and fall of Elena's breathing, her mind whirling with impossible calculations. What was her freedom worth compared to her mother's safety, her own dreams compared to the peace she saw on her mother's sleeping face? Dawn crept in gray and slow, the rain gone but the world outside still heavy with wet mist, and Isabella lay there sleepless, her eyes burning from tears she had not shed, until finally she turned toward Elena, brushing a damp strand of hair from her mother's forehead with a tenderness that masked the steel gathering in her own heart. And as the first pale light touched their window, she leaned close, her voice no more than a trembling breath but carrying the weight of a vow that would change both their lives forever, whispering, "I'll do it. I won't let them hurt you." The first light of dawn had barely broken when Isabella stepped out of the small apartment, her mother's tearful eyes lingering at the door as if afraid that letting go would shatter everything they had left. The streets were still damp from last night's rain, the air cool and strangely heavy, and as the black Moretti sedan pulled up, polished to a mirror-like gleam that caught the pale sunrise, she realized with a shiver that she was stepping into a world she had only heard about in hushed warnings. Marco opened the car door with a nod that was almost gentle, and she slid into the leather-scented interior where silence hung like a curtain between her and the man who sat across from her, Dominic Moretti, tailored black suit, crisp, blue eyes fixed on the distant skyline as though the city itself were a chessboard, and he was its master strategist. The ride stretched on, intense quiet, and Isabella's heart beat an unsteady rhythm as they passed through guarded gates into the Moretti estate, a sprawling property encircled by high walls and iron gates, where armed men stood like silent statues, their gazes sharp and unreadable beneath the brims of their caps. She caught her breath at the sight of the long driveway flanked by fountains and marble statues, lined on either side by rows of luxury cars that glistened like jewels, sleek black sedans, silver sports cars, even a vintage classic whose polished chrome reflected the morning light. The mansion rose at the end of the drive like a fortress draped in elegance, white stone walls climbing high with tall glass windows that caught the sky, and heavy doors of dark oak that swung open as if to swallow her whole. Nung out of the car, Isabella felt small and out of place, her worn shoes barely clicking against the immaculate marble floor as she was ushered into a vast foyer lit by a crystal chandelier whose glow pooled like liquid gold on the polished tiles beneath her feet. The walls were lined with oil paintings of solemn-faced men, Moretti ancestors whose stern eyes seemed to follow her as she passed, and beyond the foyer stretched a grand staircase that split in two beneath an arched skylight that filled the room with cool morning light. Dominic moved ahead of her without a word, his presence both magnetic and unnerving as they climbed the staircase and entered a long corridor where soft carpets muffled their steps, and at the very end, behind double doors of dark wood, lay his office, an imposing room dominated by an oak desk carved with intricate patterns, its surface neat save for a fountain pen, a stack of documents, and a single glass of water. The tall windows behind the desk framed the distant skyline of the city, a view that looked almost unreal from this height, and Isabella felt as though she were standing at the edge of two worlds, the struggling one she had come from, and the empire that this man controlled with a glance. Dominic took his seat, every movement deliberate and precise, then signed a paper without looking up, the scratch of the pen loud in the quiet room, and finally lifted his gaze to meet hers with a steady intensity that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine as he spoke in a voice low but edged with iron. "From this moment, you belong to the Moretti name," the words landing like a verdict rather than a vow, leaving her standing frozen for a heartbeat before she remembered to breathe. The housekeeper, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes that softened the coldness of the place, led her down another corridor, past portraits and vases of fresh lilies, to a room that seemed almost too beautiful to belong to her. Walls painted a soft cream, a bed with a carved headboard, a balcony overlooking the gardens below, where roses bloomed in disciplined rows beneath. The watch of discreetly armed guards. As the evening drew in and the sky outside her window deepened to shades of violet and blue, the mansion's lights flickered on one by one like distant stars, and Isabella sat on the edge of her new bed, staring at her trembling hands, trying to still the storm of thoughts, how far she had come in one day, how much she had lost in order to be here, and whether this house was to be a sanctuary or a gilded prison. Drawn by a faint murmur of voices in the hallway, she slipped from her room late that night, barefoot and silent, her heartbeat loud in her ears as she crept down the corridor toward the faint glow of lamplight spilling from a half-open door. There she saw Dominic in his office again, this time with Marco standing near the window, the lamplight casting long shadows across the room, and she stilled herself behind the wall as she heard Dominic's voice, lower than she had ever heard it, stripped of its usual commanding edge, saying, "I want to live as an innocent man, but this world won't let me." The quiet confession carrying a weight that made her chest ache unexpectedly, for it revealed a crack in the armor of the man she had thought untouchable. Marco said nothing, only nodded once as if acknowledging a truth they both lived by, and in that moment Isabella realized that the man who terrified her, the man who had turned her life upside down, carried regrets that perhaps even he didn't fully understand, and the thought unsettled her more than his power ever had as she stepped back into the shadows before either of them could sense her presence, her mind racing with questions that tangled hope and fear together. As she returned to her room, the mansion's corridors seemed darker and longer, as though they held secrets that the walls themselves refused to speak, and standing by the balcony window with the moonlight washing over, her pale face, Isabella's heart beat with an unfamiliar, conflicting rhythm, half fear of the lion's den she had entered, half the first stirrings of a curiosity she didn't dare admit even to herself. And she realized with a sudden, almost frightening clarity that beneath Dominic Moretti's terrifying reputation lay a man haunted by something deeper, a man whose regrets might prove just as dangerous as his power. And that knowledge left her wide-eyed and sleepless until the first light of dawn slipped once more across the distant city skyline. That night, as the house settled into a hush that made every creak of the old corridors sound like a warning, Isabella barely slept. Dawn brought the thrum of luxury cars approaching the estate, and from her window she saw men in dark suits opening the grand doors for a silver-haired, broad-shouldered man whose mere stride announced a lifetime of commanding others. Rico Moretti, Dominic's uncle, the old-guard patriarch of the family whose sharp eyes took in the mansion as if to remind it who had built this empire. By the time Isabella entered the dining hall later that evening, invited as Dominic's new bride-to-be, the room already pulsed with the kind of tension that makes silence louder than any shout. A long table set with crystal and silver under chandeliers, whose soft light glinted off Dominic's ring as he sat at the head, outwardly calm, but with a stillness like a coiled predator. Rico's voice, gravelly with age and authority, broke the air as he sneered at the sight of Isabella, calling her the maid's girl, as if the words were both a wound and a dismissal, and Elena, sitting small at the far end of the table, dropped her gaze in shame, while Isabella felt a hot rush of anger, but kept her spine straight, her hands folded to hide their tremble, The meal began in brittle civility until Rico, lifting his wine, mocked Dominic for sullying the Moretti name by marrying a servant's daughter, and the sharp scrape of Dominic's glass hitting the table made the candles tremble as he rose halfway from his chair, blue eyes locked on. His uncle with a warning that froze the servers in their tracks as he said, low and cutting, "Touch her, and you answer to me." The words carrying enough steel that even Rico shifted in his seat, though his scowl never softened. The rest of dinner passed like walking on thin ice, and just as Isabella thought the storm might be over, another appeared in the form of Sophia Leone, Dominic's ex-fiancée, gliding into the room in a crimson gown that clung to her like a weapon, her beauty as sharp as her tongue as she pretended polite greetings only to lace them with barbed remarks about how far the mighty Moretti had fallen to take in charity cases, her laughter soft and cruel as she commented on Isabella's plain dress and simple manners. Isabella felt the sting, but, remembering her mother's years of humility and the weight of Dominic's unexpected words the night before, drew herself up and replied with quiet dignity, pointing out that worth is not sewn into fabric or born from blood, but shown by courage in the face of insult. A response that silenced the table for a heartbeat and made Dominic's expression flicker, something between surprise and pride, before Sophia, unaccustomed to being met with grace instead of flustered retreat, bit her lip in frustration and turned away. The tension lingered like the taste of bitter wine as the meal ended, and when the guests had dispersed, Dominic beckoned Isabella down a quieter corridor lined with oil paintings of stern Moretti ancestors, the air there cooler, the echo of their footsteps the only sound, until he stopped beneath a tall arched window that overlooked the glittering city beyond the estate. And for the first time his voice lost its usual hard edge, soft enough that Isabella almost missed the words as he told her, "Don't let them break you. You're stronger than you think." And in that brief, unguarded moment, as the moonlight caught the tired set of his jaw and the regret in his eyes, Isabella felt the first flicker of something strange and unsettling, an understanding that beneath the armor of the feared Mafia boss stood a man fighting his own battles, and that knowledge would haunt her long after they parted for the night. Isabella lay awake long after Dominic's quiet words had faded into the echoing corridor, turning his unexpected gentleness over in her mind, like a fragile piece of glass that might shatter if she dared believe in it. And by mid-morning the next day, when Marco appeared at her door with an uncharacteristically polite knock and a brief message that "the boss wants you to come along," she followed him down to the waiting car with a mixture of guarded curiosity and a strange, unspoken hope. The ride was silent except for the hum of the engine and the occasional murmur of Marco's phone calls, until the city's concrete blocks gave way to a quieter neighborhood where the black sedan stopped before a modest brick building with cheerful murals of children playing painted across its walls. And as she stepped out, she noticed the contrast between the grim-faced guards standing by the car and the laughter drifting from the playground beyond the fence, bright as bells in spring. Dominic was already there, sleeves of his white shirt rolled to his elbows, speaking softly to a small group of children who clustered around him without a trace of fear, one little boy tugging at his wristwatch, while another handed him a crayon drawing, and the sight unsettled Isabella more than his sharpest glare ever had. For here the infamous Moretti didn't look like a mafia boss at all, but like an ordinary man whose smile came slowly, yet lit his features with a warmth she hadn't thought him capable of. He introduced her to the director of the community center, a kindly older woman who explained that Dominic had been funding the center for years, paying for books, meals, even scholarships, though he never allowed his name to be mentioned in their charity galas. And as they walked through the modest hall, where bright murals covered peeling paint, Dominic's gaze lingered on the photographs of smiling children, as if he were measuring what little good could be wrestled from a world he had long since surrendered to violence. Later, when the sun slipped low behind the city and the air turned softer with the glow of fairy lights strung across the garden courtyard of the center, he invited Isabella to step outside for some air, his voice quieter than she was used to, and in the hush that fell between them, beneath the glow of the bulbs and the faint perfume of late-blooming roses, he began to speak, not like a man delivering orders, but like someone confessing to a memory that had shaped the fault lines of his heart, telling her that on the night she had been carried half paralyzed into the hospital, her face pale and eyes closed, he had stood at her bedside gripping the edge of the metal rail and swore to himself that he would not let her die, that even if his soul was already tainted by the blood of his father's empire, he would at least save one innocent life, and that promise had haunted him every time he tried to convince himself to let her go. Isabella listened, struck silent by the raw honesty in his tone, and for the first time saw not the calculating dawn of the Moretti name, but a man fighting the tide of the world he had inherited. And when he faltered, almost as if ashamed of showing so much of himself, she surprised herself by reaching out to rest her fingers lightly on his forearm, a wordless acknowledgement that she had heard him. Dominic's eyes softened at the gesture, and after a long moment he stepped back slightly, and with a rare and almost boyish awkwardness, asked if she knew how to dance. She shook her head with a nervous laugh, and he held out his hand, palm open, patient, waiting. She placed her hand in his, and he drew her gently into the open space beneath. The fairy lights, the distant city noise fading behind the rhythm of the soft instrumental music the center staff had left playing for the children's evening party. They moved slowly, not as dancers, but as two people cautiously testing the space between them, her cheek barely grazing his shoulder as they turned in unhurried circles under the lights, their shadows swaying gently across the garden wall. And for a fleeting moment, Isabella let herself breathe in the warmth of his nearness, the steadiness of the man whose name once filled her with dread. Yet even in that tender stillness, some instinct made her glance toward the darker edge of the courtyard, and her heart stuttered when she caught a glint of something pale beyond the hedge. Sophia Leone's perfect profile half lit by the garden lantern, her lips curved in a smile that was all calculation and no kindness, watching them from the shadows as though she had just witnessed a betrayal she intended to exploit. Isabella's breath hitched, but she said nothing, letting the dance continue with the ghost of a smile fixed on her lips, while her thoughts spun in alarm, realizing that as her heart began to soften toward Dominic, new dangers were already circling in the dark, waiting to strike. The garden's fairy light glow still lingered in Isabella's thoughts as she returned to the mansion that night, her pulse unsettled, not only by the quiet way Dominic's hand had guided her through the dance, but also by the cold glint she had glimpsed in Sophia's watching eyes. Yet whatever fragile warmth had begun to form between them shattered hours later, when the wail of an alarm ripped through the midnight hush, and the mansion's tranquil corridors turned into a battlefield, boots pounding over marble floors, shouts echoing from the front gates. Isabella, startled from uneasy sleep, rushed to her door only to be yanked back by a guard who shouted for her to stay low as a sharp crack of gunfire splintered the silence, and through the chaos she caught a brief glimpse down the hall of Dominic, tall and unflinching and charmed. Sleeves, yanking open the drawer of his massive oak desk to pull free a black steel handgun. The harsh lines of his face sharpened by the flash of muzzle fire outside as Marco barked orders and rallied the household security. Smoke drifted from the shattered front windows as figures in dark hoods tried to breach the gates, and Isabella barely had time to duck behind an upturned table before Dominic strode into the hallway, scanning for her like a hawk spotting prey, his voice cutting through the roar of conflict as he called her name and motioned her forward with one arm while the other gripped the weapon steady. A gunman, having slipped past the guards in the confusion, sprang from the shadow of a pillar and raised his rifle, and Isabella's breath froze in her chest as she saw the black mouth of the barrel swing toward her, only for Dominic to lunge across the space between them, tackling her against the wall and covering her with his own body as the shot cracked and tore into the plaster inches above her head. The adrenaline-fueled weight of his presence, his breath harsh in her ear, left her momentarily speechless as he shifted to return fire with the precision of a man long accustomed to danger. Even as Marco and two other guards closed in to subdue the attacker, the skirmish raged on for what felt like an eternity, but was, in truth, only minutes. until the remaining rivals were forced back beyond the gates and the compound's reinforced doors slammed shut behind them, leaving in their wake the acrid scent of gunpowder and the shattered glitter of broken glass on marble floors. Dominic holstered his weapon with a slow, deliberate motion, then turned to Isabella, still crouched and shaking but unharmed. And for a fleeting instant, his eyes softened as he reached out to brush a loose strand of hair from her face, his voice low but steady as he said, "This is the worst world I was born into, the one I want to shield you from," the words carrying a weight of sincerity that struck deeper than the night's violence, as the mansion's staff moved to clean the wreckage, and the guards checked the grounds for stragglers. Isabella remained close to Dominic, feeling both the unwelcome thrill of having been protected by him and the cold dread of realizing how easily a bullet could have ended everything. Yet the night's terror was not done with them, for at dawn, as the city's first gray light seeped across the horizon, the flicker of television screens in the grand lounge revealed a fresh threat. Footage of the gunfight paired with a rival's venomous statement to the press, declaring that the infamous Dominic Moretti had not married for love, but had bought a maid's daughter to settle an old debt. The words slashed across the news ticker in bold letters, threatening to stain Isabella's dignity and turn public opinion against her before she could even find her place in the strange new world she had entered. And as she stared at the headline with her heart pounding, she realized the battle was far from over, that the shadows closing in were no longer just armed men at the gate, but whispers that could destroy her name and whatever fragile trust had begun to bloom between her and the man who had just saved her life. Rain-heavy clouds still hung low above the city as Isabella stood in the mansion's marble-floored foyer, her heart pounding harder than the storm outside, her eyes burning with tears and anger as she finally confronted Dominic, her voice trembling yet firm as she accused him of destroying her dignity in front of the world. Dominic, weary from the night's violence yet unwilling to flinch, let the silence stretch before he raked a hand through his damp hair and in a rough, almost broken tone, confessed that the marriage he had forced upon her had never been meant to humiliate her, that in truth he had done it to protect her from far worse enemies, and that somewhere between the day he carried her, half paralyzed, into the hospital, and night, he placed a ring on her finger. He had come to realize he needed her more than he had ever needed power or vengeance, his admission leaving Isabella shaken as the walls she had built in her heart began to crack under the weight of his honesty. But before she could respond, the sound of stilettos clicking across the marble announced the arrival of Sophia Leone, elegant and poisonous as she leveled a scornful smile at Isabella and declared with faux sweetness that no matter what charity Dominic offered, a maid's daughter could never belong in the Moretti name, her cruel words slicing the tense air, until Elena, pale but stronger now, appeared at the top of the grand staircase, leaning on the rail yet radiating maternal fierceness as she descended step by step and, to the shock of everyone in the room, stood between her daughter and Sophia and demanded that the woman keep her venom to herself, declaring in a steady voice that her daughter's honor was not for sale and that she would rather go hungry again than let Isabella be trampled by pride and gossip. The confrontation left Sophia flushed with humiliation and Dominic strangely quiet, his sharp blue eyes watching Isabella as though seeing her in a new light, while Isabella, in a trembling voiceover, reflected that the man she had once feared as a villain had bared a wounded soul beneath his armor of violence, and that perhaps she herself was no longer the powerless victim she had believed herself to be, for love, terrifying and undeniable, was beginning to alter the course of them both. That fleeting moment of almost peace shattered abruptly hours later, when Dominic went alone to meet a rival faction to negotiate a fragile truce, leaving Isabella at the mansion with Marco and her mother, only for a panicked phone call to arrive near midnight, reporting that the meeting had been an ambush and that Dominic had been caught in a hail of gunfire, his bodyguards down, and the boss himself badly wounded. Isabella's world tilted as the phone slipped from her fingers, the rush of blood in her ears drowning out. everything as she ran into the rain-slicked night, Marco barely keeping pace, the drive to the hospital a blur of sirens and flashing streetlights, and her silent prayer that the man she had once called her captor would hold on until she reached him, because the thought of losing him now felt like losing a part of her own heartbeat. In the dim hush of the private hospital corridor, the scent of antiseptics still sharp in the air and the night's drizzle misting the windows, Isabella sat hunched on the edge of a cold metal bench, her hands trembling as if she were still feeling the recoil of gunfire that had almost stolen the man lying beyond the glass doors, her heart beating so hard it blurred every distant footstep into a drumbeat of dread. When the red glow above the operating room door finally clicked off and the surgeon stepped out, pulling down his mask with a weary but faintly hopeful look, she shot to her feet and barely heard the words, "He's stable," before she stumbled forward, pressing her palm over her mouth to choke back a sob of sheer relief. Hours later, just before dawn, when the first gray light seeped into the hospital garden and a cool breeze carried the damp scent of earth after rain, she found Dominic there, propped against his wheelchair beneath a willow tree whose branches shivered like fragile green threads, his complexion still pale under the bruises, a bandage darkening his shirt near the ribs, but his blue eyes awake, fixed on her as though he'd been waiting for this moment. Her breath caught when his fingers lifted slightly in silent invitation, and she stepped closer, the grass still wet beneath her shoes, the city skyline a distant blur beyond the garden wall, as the morning haze softened the hard lines of the world, and in that fragile hour before sunrise, his voice came low and rough, carrying both exhaustion and an unexpected tenderness as he said, "I wanted to save you, but you saved me from myself," the words landing in her chest with a weight that broke something long locked inside her, and as tears pooled in her eyes she knelt beside him, taking his hand carefully as if it were more fragile than the guns he once wielded, whispering that she didn't want to leave, that she had thought she'd only ever been paying a debt, but now understood she couldn't imagine a life without the stubborn, wounded man before her. In that still garden, Elena, frail but walking with the help of a nurse, approached slowly, her shawl tugged by the soft breeze, and for the first time in months, her smile carried no shadow of fear as she rested a trembling hand on Isabella's shoulder and looked at Dominic with quiet gratitude, blessing their union with a simple, steady voice that held the weight of every hardship they had endured. A few paces away, Rico Moretti, stern as ever, his silver-streaked hair damp with the morning mist, watched them in silence, his sharp eyes betraying a hint of reluctant respect before he stepped forward at last, nodding once in grudging acknowledgement of Isabella's courage and muttering that perhaps bloodlines mattered less than the strength to stand by the family name. Isabella felt a strange, calm warmth in her chest at that, realizing that the walls around Dominic's world were beginning, brick by brick, to loosen their grip. As the sun finally rose, staining the horizon with soft gold, Dominic shifted in his chair and reached for Isabella's hand, their fingers weaving together, not like captor and captive, but like two people who had crossed through fire and come out scarred, yet unbroken. And in that quiet triumph, Isabella's voice came in a gentle narration that seemed to echo over the garden and beyond the screen. "I thought I was his prisoner, but the truth is, we rescued each other," the words lingering. GC as the camera of the story's final scene followed them from behind. Dominic carefully rising to his feet despite the stiffness in his side, Isabella steadying him, Elena just behind them with a tear-streaked smile, Rico standing with arms folded but eyes softer than before, while they moved slowly toward the hospital's main doors, the early morning light washing over their silhouettes. Outside, the rain-washed pavement gleamed like silver. A nurse pushed the doors wide, and the trio stepped through into a day that smelled of new beginnings, as the faint notes of a soft piano melody rose, and the shot tightened at last on their intertwined hands, rough palm against gentle fingers, warm and sure, holding steady as they walked forward into the sunlight, the image lingering for a heartbeat before fading to white and leaving behind only the echo of hope,